Ever get that sinking feeling? Like when a project just starts to, balloon out of control.
Oh, yeah.
Features just keep piling up. The deadlines stretch further and further. And
Like
suddenly,
drowning.
yeah, you're drowning in a sea of what everyone calls scope creep.
Right.
But today's deep dive, we're going to flip the script on that whole idea.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
So the article we're looking at today throws down a pretty bold gauntlet. It claims that scope creep, it isn't the enemy.
Okay.
It's actually a sign of something else entirely.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Incompetent and inexperienced,
Wait a minute.
to quote the author directly.
So they're not exactly pulling punches, are they?
Not at all, no.
No.
So our author today is Reactorcore,
Okay.
and they have a very specific perspective on game development. And they definitely don't shy away from strong opinions.
Okay.
But what's really fascinating about this is they see scope creep not as the root problem, but a symptom. It's like, imagine trying to build a house without a blueprint. It would be total chaos.
Yeah, that's a good analogy.
And that's how Reactorcore sees a lot of game development happening today.
Interesting.
So jumping into the code without a clear design phase, is that the real culprit here?
They would say yes, absolutely.
Tough.
Trying to design a game while you're building it, they say that leads to exactly what you described earlier.
Right.
Features just getting tacked on in this haphazard way.
Yeah.
The core vision gets muddled, and then ultimately you just end up with a final product that's less cohesive.
It just loses its way.
Exactly.
That makes sense, especially when you consider just how complex games can be these days.
Right.
But Reactorcore doesn't just call out individual developers.
No.
Right. This critique, it goes to the whole industry.
The whole industry, yeah.
What do they say about that?
Well, they make this case that this fear of scope creep, it's so widespread that it's actually had this chilling effect on innovation. Everyone's so worried about their project, spiraling out of control, that they just end up sticking to these safe, unambitious ideas.
Oh, that's interesting.
And as a result, we just see a lot of games that feel kind of, a bit uninspired.
It's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy then.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it.
If everyone's scared to push boundaries because of scope creep, then we end up with fewer groundbreaking games.
Right.
And that just reinforces the fear even more.
Exactly. It's a vicious cycle.
And it's not just affecting the games themselves.
No.
Right. It impacts the people making them, too.
Absolutely.
What did they say about that?
Well, think about all the aspiring developers out there, all the new people getting into the industry.
Yeah.
And then they're told to avoid their dream game, as their first project.
Oh, yeah.
That's incredibly discouraging.
That's a really good point. You need that passion.
You do.
That personal connection to fuel you through all the inevitable challenges that come up in game development.
Right. And you need that fire.
Wouldn't starting small be a good way to learn the ropes, though?
Sure, yeah.
Before tackling something huge?
They would probably argue that you learn best by diving into the deep end.
Okay.
But they propose a different approach altogether.
Okay, what's that?
They call it scope maximization.
So instead of minimizing scope to avoid creep,
Right.
they want us to maximize it.
Exactly.
That sounds, counterintuitive to say the least.
It might sound like a recipe for disaster,
Yeah.
but it's actually all about meticulous planning.
Okay.
Imagine an architect, meticulously designing every single detail of a building before they even break ground.
Wow. Yeah.
That's the level of preparation that we're talking about.
Okay.
Scope maximization is about thoroughly mapping out the full potential of your game during that initial design phase.
So brainstorm every feature, every mechanic, every content idea you can possibly imagine. Isn't that a bit overwhelming?
It can be, definitely.
Yeah.
It requires a real shift in mindset.
Mm.
But Reactorcore argues that it's crucial to explore the full range of possibilities before you get locked into any specific implementation.
Okay.
It's about understanding that creative and technical potential of your game before you write a single line of code. It's about pushing those boundaries, of what your game could be.
Yeah.
Even if some of those ideas, they never actually make it into that final product.
Right.
Reactorcore encourages developers to just use whatever tools or techniques they need
Okay.
to just explore all those possibilities, building quick prototypes, testing out theories,
Yeah.
and even just pondering the viability of certain features.
Right.
All this helps to create a more comprehensive understanding of the game's potential.
So it's not just dreaming big. It's about getting your hands dirty and actually experimenting to see what works.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And it's not just the creative aspects either.
Right.
Scope maximization, it also involves understanding the technical limitations of your tools and your platforms.
Okay.
Like if you're using a particular game engine, you need to know its strengths and weaknesses before you start designing systems that it might not be able to handle.
That makes a lot of sense, yeah. Like trying to build this sprawling open world game on an engine that's better suited for like 2D platformers.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, that would probably be a recipe for disaster.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And beyond the technical stuff, scope maximization also forces you to think about things like the budget, team size, your target audience. It's about creating a game that's ambitious, but also realistic to actually develop.
Right.
And likely to resonate with players.
So finding that sweet spot between pushing the creative envelope and making sure you're not biting off more than you can chew.
Exactly. It's about making informed decisions, you know, about what features are truly essential to that core experience and which ones, you know, might be better left for later.
Okay.
Or maybe even scrapped altogether.
Right.
Like instead of throwing every ingredient you can find into a dish, you carefully select the ones that will create the most flavorful and balanced meal.
Yeah, that's a good analogy.
Right.
So once you've gone through this whole comprehensive exploration of the game's potential, both creatively and technically, what's the next step in the scope maximization process?
It's all about prioritizing and refining those ideas.
Okay.
But without getting bogged down in the minutia.
Right.
Remember, the goal here isn't to create this rigid blueprint, but a flexible roadmap.
So it's more about establishing those core pillars of the game.
Yes.
The gameplay mechanics, the overall aesthetic, the narrative themes.
Right.
And understanding how they all relate to one another.
Exactly.
Okay.
It's about creating this framework that can evolve and adapt as you move through development. Because, as we've already talked about, unexpected challenges are just inevitable.
Right.
But having that clear vision from the outset, it'll help you make more informed decisions when those challenges arise.
It sounds like scope maximization isn't just about preventing scope creep.
No.
It's like changing your whole entire approach to game development.
It is.
Instead of just reacting to problems as they pop up, you're trying to anticipate them and build in that flexibility from the very start.
And that brings us to another key concept from Reactorcore.
Okay, what's that?
Paranoid design.
Paranoid design.
Yes.
Oh.
Okay, now I'm really intrigued. What does that even mean?
Well, you might guess from the name. It's about anticipating potential problems.
Okay.
And building in safeguards to mitigate those problems.
So thinking through all the things that could go wrong.
Yes.
And having a plan B or even a plan C ready to go.
Exactly.
Lovely.
Think of it like designing a building with movable walls.
Okay.
If you need to rearrange that interior space later on, you can...
Without having to demolish the entire structure?
Yeah.
It's about creating a system that's robust enough to handle change without completely falling apart.
I like that analogy.
Right.
So in terms of game design, what would that look like in practice?
Well, for example, let's say you're designing a combat system for an RPG.
Okay.
A paranoid design approach might involve creating a system that can easily accommodate new character classes or enemy types without requiring this complete overhaul of the underlying mechanics.
Okay.
Or if you're working on a level design system, you might build in that flexibility so you can adapt those levels to different environments or gameplay scenarios.
Right.
It's all about thinking ahead and creating systems that are inherently adaptable.
That's a really interesting way to think about it. It's almost like you're designing the game to be future-proof.
Right.
But wouldn't that level of preparation add a lot of time and complexity to the development process?
It certainly requires more upfront investment. But Reactorcore would argue that it pays off in the long run.
Okay.
By anticipating those problems and designing for that flexibility,
yeah,
you can avoid those costly and time-consuming rework cycles.
Right.
That so often plague game development.
Yeah, it's like taking out insurance on your game in a way.
Exactly.
You're investing a little extra now to avoid those potentially massive headaches down the road.
Exactly. Yeah. And beyond the practical benefits.
Okay.
There's also a creative aspect to paranoid design.
Okay.
By thinking about all the different ways a game could evolve.
Yeah.
You're opening up these new possibilities.
Yeah.
Pushing yourself to think outside the box. It can actually be quite liberating.
So it's not just mitigating risk, it's about fostering creativity.
Exactly.
Okay, that's a good point. but wouldn't all this planning and preparation stifle those spontaneous moments of inspiration?
That's a common concern.
Yeah.
But Reactorcore argues that thorough planning, it doesn't have to be at odds with creative inspiration. In fact, they believe that having a solid foundation can actually free you up to be more creative.
Oh, so?
Because you're not constantly worrying about the technical or logistical details.
So it's like having a safety net
Right.
that lets you take more creative risks.
Exactly.
Okay.
And this brings us back to Reactorcore's central point.
Yeah.
Scope creep, it isn't the enemy.
Mm-hmm.
It's just a symptom of poor planning.
Right.
By embracing scope maximization and paranoid design, you can actually turn what's often seen as this negative force into a positive one.
So instead of fearing change,
Right.
you're embracing it
Exactly.
and using it to your advantage.
Yep.
That's a pretty radical shift in perspective.
It is.
How does this all tie back to that human element of game development that we were talking about earlier?
Well, I think there's a lot of overlap
Okay.
between these concepts
Yeah.
and the idea of fostering a more supportive and empowering environment for game developers.
Mm-hmm.
Remember, Reactorcore is very critical of that traditional fear-mongering around scope creep, especially for newcomers.
Right. They argue that it can be incredibly demotivating to tell aspiring developers that their dream projects are too risky or complex to pursue.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think scope maximization and paranoid design, they offer a way to address those fears
Okay.
without stifling creativity or ambition.
So it's about providing a framework for success
Yes.
rather than just throwing developers in the deep end and hoping they don't drown.
Precisely.
Okay.
And that brings us to, I think, a key takeaway from Reactorcore's article.
Okay.
It's not about saying that scope creep is never a problem,
Mm-hmm.
or that every game should be as ambitious and complex as possible.
Right.
It's about recognizing that there's a more nuanced and thoughtful way
Yeah.
to approach scope management,
Mhm.
one that prioritizes both creativity and practicality.
So it's about finding that balance
Yes.
between dreaming big
Yeah.
and making sure that those dreams are grounded in reality.
Exactly. And it's about creating a culture of game development that embraces ambition and encourages developers to push those boundaries
Yeah.
without sacrificing quality or feasibility.
It strikes me that this whole approach could be really beneficial
Mm-hmm.
for newer developers.
Yeah.
Instead of being paralyzed by that fear of scope creep,
Right.
they could actually feel empowered
Yeah.
to tackle those ambitious projects
Mm-hmm.
that might have seemed too daunting before.
It's like giving them a roadmap
Yeah,
and a set of tools to navigate that complex landscape.
exactly.
And beyond just the practical benefits,
Mhm.
I think there's this real psychological boost
Yeah.
that comes with feeling prepared and confident
Mhm.
in your ability to manage scope.
It's like the difference between setting off on this cross-country road trip
Right.
with a detailed map and a well-stocked car
Yeah.
versus just hitting the gas and hoping for the best.
Yeah.
One approach is bound to be a lot more stressful.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
And speaking of stress, that's another area where Reactorcore's approach could have this positive impact
Okay.
by encouraging that thorough planning
Right.
and anticipating those potential problems.
Mm.
You're essentially creating this less chaotic and unpredictable development environment.
It's about creating a more stable foundation.
Yeah, and that can only be a good thing
Right.
for the well-being of the people making the game.
Absolutely.
It's easy to get so caught up in the excitement,
Mhm.
of creating something new
Right.
that we forget about the toll that crunch culture and constant firefighting
Yeah.
can take
No,
on developers.
burnout's a very real issue in this industry.
It is.
And I think Reactorcore's emphasis on thoughtful planning and sustainable development practices, it's a really welcome antidote to that problem.
So it's not just about making better games.
Yeah.
It's about creating a better industry
It is.
for the people who make those games.
Exactly. And ultimately, I think that benefits everyone,
Yeah.
including the players. When developers are happy and supported,
Mm-hmm.
they're more likely to create games that are innovative, engaging, and full of passion.
Absolutely. And that brings us back to you, the listener.
Yes.
What can you take away from all of this? Well, whether you're a seasoned developer or just starting out,
Right.
I think Reactorcore's perspective offers a valuable challenge
It does.
to that traditional fear-mongering around scope creep.
Mm-hmm.
It's a call to embrace a more thoughtful and strategic approach to game development,
It is.
one that prioritizes both ambition and sustainability.
It's about recognizing that planning isn't the opposite of creativity,
Right.
but rather a way to unleash that creativity
Yeah.
in a more focused and effective way.
And it's about understanding that change isn't something to be feared, but rather an opportunity to learn, to adapt, and ultimately to create something truly special.
So as you embark on your next game development journey, I encourage you to embrace the spirit of scope maximization and paranoid design. Don't be afraid to dream big and push the boundaries of what's possible.
Push to those boundaries.
But also take the time to plan carefully.
Yes.
Anticipate those challenges and build in that flexibility from the start.
Okay.
And most importantly, don't lose sight of that human element.
Right.
Take care of yourself. Support your fellow developers. And create games that you're truly passionate about.
Because at the end of the day, that's what it's all about.
It is
creating something meaningful, something that brings joy to both the creators and the players.
Exactly.
This has been The Deep Dive.
Yes.
Thanks for joining us.